The concept clear to you? Is the concept clear to you? అర్థమైందమ్మా మా కాంపోనెంట్స్. నెక్స్ట్ డైనమిక్ ఇన్వోకేషన్ అనేది ఎలా జరుగుతుంది? హౌ దిస్ డైనమిక్ ఇన్వోకేషన్ హ్యాపెన్స్ ఇన్ so what happens is client receives a what happens is client receives a what happens is client receives a remote reference to an object whose remote interface was not available at compile time. Whose remote reference not available at compile time, not at compile time. So what it will do? So client receives a request whose remote reference not available at the compile time. So there is another way for invoking the remote object. So client has to invoke the object. So how it will invoke? So this is nothing but the dynamic invocation. It is nothing but dynamic invocation. Dynamic invocation. The client don't know the invocation. Sorry, don't know the remote reference at compile time. What it will do? It goes for dynamic invocation. It goes for dynamic. So it gives the client access to a generic representation of remote invocation. Okay. So like a do operation method which is available in request request service. Okay, like do operation method available in the request request service. So yeah, in Corba how it happens? In Corba happens, it is called interface repository. In Corba this dynamic invocation happens through interface repository. Interface repository in Corba. In Corba, the dynamic invocation happens through interface repository, and that dynamic invocation is not so convenient to use as a proxy. Okay, but is used in application where not all interfaces of the remote objects to be used and can be predicted at design time. Okay, so for example, if you say, I mean, we will see in Java RMI. So how this dynamic invocation will happen? Like we will see one class called whiteboard application. So it could be the circle, to draw a circle, square, or any shape. So that were not predicted at compile time. Okay, so a client that uses dynamic invocation is able to address this challenge. Clear? So dynamic invocation, some classes, some remote references are not available at compile time for the client to execute. So those remote references are provided as dynamic invocation. That means we can provide those remote references at runtime. This is about the dynamic invocation. Next, dynamic skeletons. One more topic in RMI, dynamic skeletons. So skeleton and skeleton is actually the which invoke the method present in the servant. Skeleton is the component which is generated by the RMI software, which will invoke the method present in the servant. Okay, that we know. So what are these dynamic skeletons means? Okay, what are these dynamic skeletons means? For example, client may supply a new type of shape to the shared whiteboard for it to store. Okay, so a server with dynamic skeletons would be able to deal with this situation. Okay, ante ikkada kuda ante. So skeletons which are provided at runtime, that is not at the compile time. Okay, for example, a new remote, type of shape in a whiteboard application. If a new type of shape is supplied to the skeleton, supplied to the server actually. So server contains only one skeleton, one dispatcher. Okay, so dynamic dispatcher, dynamic skeleton. So what dynamic skeleton, what it will do is it will simply supply a new shape to the shared whiteboard and store it. That's nothing but the. Suppose we can use a general dispatcher and the dynamic downloading of classes to the server. Okay, clear? Other than skeleton, dynamic skeleton which is Suppose if a new type of shape is applied to an object, then which is not provided at compile time, then dynamic skeleton is required, because the skeleton client, the skeleton proxy and dispatcher, these three are generated at the RMI software using a compile time, RMI compiler. That means at compile time. Suppose if any extra need to handle, those will be done by this dynamic skeleton. Done by the dynamic. Next is server and client program. Next is what? Client program and server program. So the server program, local parts are now we'll see overall. So now what a server program contains? It contains the classes for dispatcher, contains the classes for skeleton, and skeleton together with implementation of classes of servants. Okay, it contains the classes for skeleton, classes for dispatcher, and classes for servants. Classes for servants. So in addition, the server, apart from these three, the server program also contains initialization. What it will contain? Initialization. So what is this? What is this initialization? So initialization is responsible for creating and initializing at least one of the servants to be hosted by the server. So this initialization is a process which actually do this, create these servants. And additional servants may be created in response to requests from the clients. So more than one servant is also possible to create by the initialization in the server program. And next is will contain the class of the client program will contain the classes of the process for all the what a client program server contains: skeleton classes, dispatcher classes, servant classes, and initialization. What the client contain? Client contain proxy classes. What it will contain? Proxy classes for all the remote objects that it will invoke. For all the remote objects that it will invoke. Client program contains what? Proxy classes. Clear? Next is factory methods. What are factory methods in RMI? What are factory methods in RMI? Next we need to discuss this one. So remote object definitions cannot include constructors. There are no constructors because interfaces do not contain, only unimplemented methods and variables only contains by these interfaces. So this means that servers cannot be created by remote invocation on constructors. So we cannot create servants. So servants are only created by the initialization of the server. Okay. So the term factory method is sometimes used to refer to a method that creates a servants. So factory method is a method used to create these servants. And a factory is an object with factory methods. What is a factory object? A factory object is a object with factory methods. And what is a factory method? Factory method is a method used to create the servants, because it is not created by the remote interfaces. Because the remote interface does not contain constructors. Okay. So in order to create a remote object on demand, so client must provide methods. Client must provide the methods to its interface for this purpose. Okay, so client must provide the methods in this remote interface so that you can create the interfaces in the form of factory methods. Next is binder. Next is what? Binder. ఈ బైండర్ అనే టర్మ్ ఆర్పిసిలో కూడా వచ్చింది. ఆర్పిసిలో బైండర్ ఆథెంటికేషన్ కూడా చదివాం మనం. వాట్ ఈస్ దిస్ బైండర్ ఇన్ ఆర్ఎంఐ? RMI so requires a client program requires a mean obtaining a remote reference object. Sir, hello. So these client programs generally require a means of obtaining a remote object reference for at least one of the remote objects held by the server. For example, object A, let's say this is a network, this is a remote reference. So this is B. Network is some network problem. Okay, some network problem here.
Done.
So what is this binder? Next is, what is this binder? Okay, this binder is a client program. So distributed system is a separate set that maintains a table containing a mapping from textual to remote object references. Textual to remote object references. Okay, this is the purpose of this binder. So it contains a table which maps the textual names to object reference, and it is used by whom? It is used by servers. Okay, to register the remote objects by name. To register their okay. Next, what is server threads? What is server threads? So with this, we will wind up and we will discuss in the next class. Okay. So server thread. So threading in server, why it is required? So server generally allocate a separate thread for execution of each remote invocation. Okay, suppose more than one method we need to execute. So how can we do that? So for each method, we'll associate a thread with it. Okay. For each thread, we will associate a method. And we can execute that method in the particular thread for some time. Okay. So this is about the server threads. Okay. We'll continue in the next class. Thank you. So can I ask few questions before leaving? Can I ask few questions? Okay. What RMI software contains? Can anyone answer? What an RMI software contains? What an RMI software contains? What an RMI software contains? So RMI software contains skeleton, dispatcher, and proxy. These are the three components which contain RMI. Okay. Bye. See you tomorrow.